Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today is Tuesday, October 11, 2011, and we're right smack in the middle of learning Module 3, which you began on October 4th, and you have until, I think, next Monday night to complete. Complete by October 17th. Now, this learning module has a number of readings and viewings. There are a couple, more than a couple, 3 or 4 video clips that you needed to look at, and if you haven't, you need to look at them in the future. There's also a discussion board that's due. You need to post by October 13th, your first post, and your subsequent posts need to be posted no later than October 17th, 10 p.m. Now again, these are just guidelines for your postings. You can post as many times as you want. You can post before October 13th. You can post before October 17th. What typically happens, and it's okay, it's not ideal, but it's okay. I noticed there's a flurry of postings between 6 and 10 o'clock the evening that they're due. And that's okay, because that creates almost a chat-like environment, almost a real-time kind of discussion board. But it doesn't have to be that way, so I just want you to appreciate that. Now today we're going to focus on the PowerPoint that you had available for download, and I'm displaying that now in class. There was also a PowerPoint that was configured for note-taking that's printable as well. Both of these PowerPoints are in PDF format, so you could print them if you desire and take notes, and some of you may have, I see, a binder with all of my readings in the binder, and that's great. Old school analog paper, and she can take notes right on the paper. That's great. And this lecture is available as a video as well. If you chose to watch it, and I told you you didn't have to, and if you did choose to click on it and watch it or click around, you'll see that it's going to be nearly the same as I'm going to present this evening. What will be different is I'll be here speaking to you, and we'll have an opportunity for feedback. I recorded that in my studio, which is just my office at my house, with my headphones on. And this is about children's language skills, and I emphasize, and I continue to emphasize, that we really need to understand how children perceive the world around them, how they grow and develop, how they think, how their cognition works, that is, how their brain and thinking works. In order to do a good interview, a baseline for doing competent interviews is to understand how children develop. And one way to develop is linguistically. And I am passionate about understanding the basics of children and language, because that's the primary way we communicate with kids, right? We sit down in an interview room, or we go into an empty space in a school, or we go in some other environment, and it's just us and the child, and we need to get information from them about the past, and we need to tap into their recollection, and there are so many forces and so many issues in play at that time that we need to do the best we can and be mindful of all of them. But the primary way we communicate is through words, through language, verbally, orally, correct? I mean, that's the way we communicate with kids. We expect to ask them something we call a question that draws for a response. And they will respond to us with words as well. They will respond to us with language. They will respond to us to the best of their linguistic capabilities. So it makes good sense, I would suggest, that we have an appreciation of how kids develop and where they are typically at different stages of their development or their life cycle with regard to language and words and related concepts. So today is going to be mostly about children and language and how kids communicate and how we need to communicate to kids. We need to appreciate what their limitations are so that we can ask questions that are consistent with their abilities. Now, you will learn later, if I haven't already made this observation in this class, that kids communicate in a variety of ways. The big three are language, which we'll talk about today, behavior, and emotions. And we'll get into that more later on. Interestingly, I'm about to talk about language as a tool for communication. It is the least reliable among the three kinds of ways that kids communicate. I'm not suggesting it's unreliable, it's reliable. I mean, in most cases, we can discern what the child is attempting to express by the words that they use. I'm just expressing to you that comparatively, when you look at language, behavior, and emotions, that the more reliable of that group of ways that kids communicate is not language. What do you think it is?
Behavior?
Behavior and emotions. They're kind of linked, right? Behavior and emotions. Because as you know, many of you interview kids or have kids or deal with kids. It is easy to make misstatements using language. It's easy to attempt to mask the truth by saying something didn't happen or something happened differently from the reality of it simply by using words. It's easy to say I wasn't there, or he didn't come in the room, or the light wasn't on with words. It's easy to mask the past if someone wants to do that by simply being deceptive about it through the use of language. It's a lot harder to mask people's emotions. It's a lot harder to mask how a person feels about the question that's asked. It's a lot harder to mask your behavior and your emotions. And kids, children just aren't good at hiding their emotions. And they're just not good at hiding the messages we get from their behavior in an interview room. Adults aren't very good at it. I mean, one of the things that I do and my staff does as a prosecutor is interrogate suspects. And we focus less on what they say and more on how they say it. And when I argue to juries about the culpability or responsibility, or whether someone is guilty or whether someone is hiding something, I typically don't point to what they say, I point to how they say it. So adults have a hard time masking their intent or what's true and not true by attempting to control their emotions. Kids are just plain poor at it. They're not good at hiding their emotions, and they're not good at hiding the messages we get from their behavior. It is the most reliable of the three ways that kids communicate. That is behavior and emotions. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later when we get down into the nitty-gritty of forensic interviewing. Nevertheless, the primary way we communicate is through language and words. So let's take a look at that. Children's language skills. Professor Anne Grafam Walker, who is a linguist, a forensic linguist, and has written a couple of books and published a few articles on children and language, makes the observation that even very young children can tell us what they know if we ask them the right questions in the right way. Now, among your readings were readings by Professor Walker. I've reproduced them for you here in Learning Module 3. Linguistic problems to look for in your questioning and things to look out for in children's answers. That's chapters 3 and 4 from Professor Anne Grafam Walker. I start out this presentation by highlighting one of her observations. Again, that is, even real little kids can tell us what they know if we ask the right kinds of questions. And those questions, like everything we do in forensic interviewing, are questions that speak to the child's abilities and stage in development. To become a competent speaker, a child has to acquire two things, basically. Language, and what do we mean by language? We mean words. Words. Vocabulary, grammar. They need to acquire language, but equally important, in fact, perhaps more important, is experience with how to use the language. So words alone, the acquisition of words and their symbolic meaning, what they represent, if I say bottle of soda, those are just utterances that I present to you to consider. Eventually, one learns that a bottle of soda, that utterance refers to what I have in my left hand, a bottle of soda. And it's about the context that we learn what these words are symbolic of. So the simple acquisition of words does not make someone a competent speaker. I have made the observation in the past that the film Splash, that stars Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah, and it's about 15, 20 years old now, is a real good example. In that movie, Tom Hanks is a middle-class single guy who encounters a washed-up mermaid. Daryl Hannah is the mermaid. It's a wacky Disney-sponsored, Disney-produced comedy. The mermaid winds up spending the first couple of days in his apartment alone. And most of the time she's watching television. And, you know, by the end of the second day or so, she's able to speak in English in a competent way. The suggestion is that by watching television 24 hours a day for those few days, she was able to acquire language. But the problem with that is it doesn't work that way. You need to hear the words, but you also need context. And that's how kids grow, and that's how they develop language. Moms don't simply say, drink your milk. Moms say, drink your milk, and present the child with a bottle. Or moms don't say, bring me a cookie, and the child brings a cookie. Moms say, bring me a cookie or get a cookie, and point to the cookie jar. Or open the cookie jar and take the lid off and say, go ahead, take a cookie. It's okay, take a cookie. And that context, the mom's voice, the words that are used, the child listening to the words, looking at the cookie jar, seeing a cookie pulled that mom might eat, reaching in and taking the cookie, make that magical thing happen that is language acquisition. So you can't learn language in a vacuum. You need to have experience, which is the second bullet point, with using that language. No more than I can watch Spanish language television all day and all night for a week and speak to someone who speaks Spanish. It won't happen. On the other hand, if I go to Madrid or to San Juan and I spend 3 months there, and I go out and eat, and I go to the movies, and I go to the park, and I go to the university, and I go to the library, in those months, by listening to people, by experience with using the language in context, I should come back conversationally adept in Spanish, one would hope. And that's the way to learn language best, right? To immerse yourself in the culture and context of the language. You look at this woman, Amanda Knox, who was acquitted by the appellate court in Italy. Now, this is an American girl, young lady, from Washington State, I believe, who goes to study in Italy, like many students do, and then gets involved in this terrible murder, or at least it happens at her apartment, and she's charged, and whatever the truth is, she is exonerated by a higher court. It was just interesting to watch her speak Italian so fluently in her own defense. I mean, here everything's riding on it, yet she speaks Italian so fluently and so effortlessly that she can make a passionate plea to the appellate court in Italy about her freedom and about her responsibility for this murder, or lack of responsibility for this murder. And that's because she's been in Italy for the past few years. And in the beginning of her stay there, which was for academic reasons, she had to survive there and had to exist in a context. One of the most interesting things to watch, and it just seems even almost like Amanda Knox, is to watch Kobe Bryant speak Italian, the great shooting guard for the Los Angeles Lakers. He grew up in part in Italy because his father, I think his name was Joe Bryant, played in the Italian League. So here's this African-American high school superstar who speaks flawless Italian, which is, interesting to look at. Now here, he grew up in part in Italy, so he immersed himself there, obviously speaks fluent Italian and fluent English as well. And that's the way kids grow, that's the way they acquire language, in a context, in an environment. It's acquired unconsciously. There's no way to teach it. It kind of happens. All this stuff comes together. It's part of the human experience to acquire language by interacting with other people and by using words in context in a very specific environment. In fluid stages, and there it is again, environment, real world context. And when it comes to kids, with adult help. One of the things that Ganeshi, that was one of the articles that you read about language, and that's more about the auditory aspects of hearing words and repeating them. That Celia Ganeshi was one of the articles that you read. Phonemes, I think it is, and the other constituent parts of sounds and syllables. She makes the observation in that article that constant correction of children when they're acquiring a language won't be very helpful. It's not really a good thing for parents and caregivers to do. They learn on their own. They shed statements like, me want milk, and it changes to I want milk. And you can correct them over and over again. It's not going to have as much impact as their requesting milk over and over again and listening to other people request milk and learning the rules of vocabulary and language on their own in the real world environment in which they exist. And the English language has more rules and more peculiarities than any other language. Yet children by the age of 6 or 7 follow most of those rules and respect those rules and communicate with us in a way that utilizes those rules. And there are many of them, and they are varied. It happens. It happens. So the constant correction is not helpful. Any questions or observations or stories about your own kids or kids you've seen in those early stages of learning? Okay. Well, preschoolers typically are very literal, and we talked about that a little bit when we looked at the video clip of, that boy's name was Clinton, when Clinton was talking about boxers and briefs or boxers and underwear. That's an example of being very literal, and I gave you other examples, and the reason why we highlight that is because we know that these kids are very literal, they're very rigid, they're just learning words, and if a word is associated with something, then that's what that thing means. It's not until they grow older that they appreciate the nuances of language and that the same word, okay, can represent two different things or concepts. I think one of the articles that you read talked about, what was that? There's a book, Amelia Bedelia. Is that right?
Yeah.
Draw the drapes or draw the curtains. Now, most children are learning that the word draw means to take a pen or a crayon and to create some representation of something else, right? To draw something. Excuse me. But draw can mean a variety of things. And again, I'm told, I don't speak multiple languages, but I'm told that there are more of these homonyms, there are more of these synonyms, there are more of these words with double and triple and quadruple meanings in the English language than any other language. You can draw a picture, you can draw the curtains, you can draw a draft beer. Right? And there are probably other meanings for the word draw. And guess what? It's spelled D-R-A-W. And guess what? It's pronounced D-R-A-W. Right? So there are scores and scores of examples of that kind of linguistic issue that might arise when communicating with kids. So they're very literal, and they're just beginning to learn the primary use of the words in their vocabulary, never mind the secondary and tertiary uses of those words or their homonym meanings and the like. Some of the examples are kids may live in an apartment, and that's what they call it. They live in an apartment. They don't live in a house. They live in an apartment. To them, the living space that they're in is an apartment. It's quite different from a house, or it's the only word. I've talked about trailers and projects and other characterizations of children's living spaces that are very literal and not very nuanced. We're older, we're adults, we have a greater command of language, and thus we can understand when somebody asks us where the house is that we live. Even if we live in an apartment, we don't correct them and go, well, I don't live in a house, I actually live in an apartment, but it's at 133 Jones Street. We just give them the address. You know. But kids are very literal. You know, they may draw a very rigid distinction between their clothes and their PJs. Were you wearing any clothes when Uncle Jerry came in your room? No, I wasn't wearing my clothes. Okay. Now, he touched you on your body? No, he didn't touch me on my body. You said he put his hand on your coochie, and you weren't wearing any clothes, so his skin touched your skin? No, his skin didn't touch my skin. Well, I asked you earlier, you said you weren't wearing any clothes. I wasn't wearing any clothes. What's happening here? There's a linguistic breakdown, right? Because PJs or jammies or nightgowns are not clothes. They are to us. They're a subcategory of clothing. Among clothing are pajamas and underwear and pants and blouses and shirts and jerseys and all that stuff. But to a child, not all children, but some kids, PJs are not clothes. Your clothes you wear in a day, your PJs you wear at night, or your pajamas, your jammies, or your nightgown, or whatever. But you see how there's a disconnect where you have a linguistic breakdown, where there's a language breakdown, and where that can take us as a forensic interviewer. 7 questions down the road, we're assuming that it was skin-on-skin contact, and that's important in our world. Penetration, the intrusiveness of the molest, it's important, right? We're 7 questions from the question about what they were wearing, and we're befuddled because they're not answering the question consistent with our assumption about what they were wearing, that they weren't wearing anything. Because 7 questions ago, there was a linguistic breakdown. There was a language breakdown. Now, the remedy is, and I emphasize this over and over again, you may not understand what the breakdown is. It may not be linguistic at all. I'm giving you examples of language breakdowns. It could be emotional or psychological or whatever. But the way to address these issues when you're just not communicating, you know, you're like, I'm not, how could it be not skin on skin if she doesn't have her clothes on? I mean, is just to flip the question around. Or go back to the original issue and said, well, earlier you told me that you didn't have your clothes on. Tell me more about that. What was on your body? I mean, if it's a clothes issue, like the question that I just gave as an example, you want to go back to that. But sometimes you don't know what it is. Ask the question differently. Well, I asked you whether it was skin on skin. What part of his body touched your body? His hand touched my coochie. What part of you did his hand touch? Touch my panties or my nightgown or whatever. Just switch the question around. Try a new question, a different question. One that's phrased differently, not the same question. Just switch it up. Ask it differently. And you will likely stumble upon, okay, and that may be the wrong way to express it, but you may reconnect with that child. If you're here and you're missing one another, you may reach understanding. Because there are a lot of different reasons why there could be that breakdown later on. I gave you one of language, but you may not observe. You may not make that connection. The great news for forensic interviewers is you don't have to figure out what the problem is. As you get better and better, you will. As you get better and better, you'll be in a much more advanced position in your interviews, and you can kind of figure out, you know what, I asked their clothes, maybe it's PJs. You know, you get good at what you do. But even if you're not there yet, simply by switching the question around or taking a different route to the same area about what part of his body touched what part of the child's body, you may get an answer that seems more logical and more reliable. Preschoolers can't understand abstracts. Truth, lie, these vague and abstract concepts. Very difficult for preschoolers and beyond their competence. They have trouble with pronouns. They have trouble with pronouns. I have a big problem with pronouns. And one of the areas in which I teach law enforcement and child protection workers and others is documentation and report writing. I don't do a lot of it, but it's important to me because as a lawyer and as a prosecutor, and a deputy attorney general will tell you the same thing, as an advocate that has to go into a courtroom and rely on the written record that's prepared by field level investigators, it's critical that there be enough clarity and precision in those reports so that we can convince a judge or a jury or some other person in a decision-making role of what happened. And lack of clarity in documentation and report writing makes me bristle. It upsets me. And, you know, not everybody is a good writer. I appreciate that. But you can become a better writer by following some simple rules. And one of the rules is, and it's related to what we do here, it's just not me going off on my pet peeves, is avoid pronouns at all costs. Especially because we're talking about forensic interviewing. Most kids, even older kids, but especially preschoolers and latency age kids, have a tough time with pronouns. Pronouns are peculiar. Pronouns are referred to by Anne Griffon Walker as indexicals. Another way to think about them is they relate back. They relate back to something else. They're placeholders. They're not the noun. They're not the thing we're talking about. It's a shortcut. It's a linguistic shortcut. So rather than saying Barack Obama, we say he. Rather than saying Kobe Bryant, we say he. Rather than saying Amanda Knox, we say she. Okay? These are substitutes for proper nouns or for concrete words. And the problem with pronouns is it requires that you go back and link it up with the noun or the name or the more concrete word. And that requires some mental prowess. For example, have you ever read the newspaper? And most newspapers, the old school newspapers, you know, that are made out of paper, and you get the newspaper and the articles in most newspapers are continued on page A6 or page S15. You get about a third of the article and sometimes less on the front page or the page you start on, and it refers you to some other page. And you flip those pages over and you continue reading the article. And if you're reading an article that says Barack Obama explained to Hillary Rodham Clinton that Condoleezza Rice will be in Lebanon at that time and help present the government's point of view. You're on the page later on and it says she has told the government there in no uncertain terms that we will not cooperate on that issue. Now, who's she? Condoleezza Rice or Hillary Rodham Clinton? I need to go back to page A1 to link up the she with the person who said that. Now, they're both, one's a former diplomat, one is the current diplomat, the Secretary of State of the United States. It could be either one. Contextually, I don't know who it is. Either one of them could have expressed themselves about this issue in the Mideast. So you got to go back. You know, we adults do that. We know to go back. And sometimes we can just tell by context. If they said, she said in 2011 or in January 2011, I'm going to assume it's Hillary Clinton because Condoleezza Rice is no longer in a position of governmental authority. But again, one way to avoid turning the page back and doing these mental gymnastics to figure out what the hell she means is to say Condoleezza Rice or Hillary Rodham Clinton. You can never have too many concrete nouns and too many proper nouns in our writing. Even if it seems awkward. Now, I'm not saying Condoleezza Rice appeared at 12 noon for a luncheon address and she spoke about X. I'm not suggesting one writes Condoleezza Rice appeared at lunch and Condoleezza Rice gave a lunchtime address in the same sentence. We don't need to be that clunky in our prose. Nevertheless, I prefer that over ambiguity. In the case of children, getting back to our discussion here about children and language, because pronouns are inherently ambiguous, right? Ambiguous means capable of multiple interpretations, right? If I said she is the smartest student in the room, who am I talking about? Well, we can eliminate maybe 4 or 5 men in the room, but we have a whole group of women here, right? That she relates to somebody. I don't know which she it is. It could mean any one of the women in this room. It's capable of referring to any one of the women in this room. So it's ambiguous. And when you pack a narrative or a discussion with pronouns, and you may say, well, who does that? We all do it. He, she, it, they. They's a pronoun. She's a pronoun. It's a pronoun. Grandpa then came downstairs and went in there to get his knife. There's a pronoun. I don't know what there is. Is there the cupboard? Is there his strong box? Is there his bedroom? Is there a drop ceiling? When we write, we ought to be concrete and we ought to avoid pronouns. When we interview kids, we ought to avoid pronouns. For every pronoun, you can use a concrete word all the time, every time. There is always a concrete word to substitute for a pronoun. So we need to speak concretely to kids, and we need to use less pronouns. Even grandma or your cousin is a form of pronoun or a placeholder. Your cousin could be any one of your cousins, right? Now, again, contextually, we may be able to figure out who the cousin is because there was only one person introduced in the interview, and his name was Joe, and the boy says, my cousin Joe came in the room. It's the only cousin we're talking about, so it may be okay to use the word cousin later on in the interview. But a good forensic interviewer, even though contextually in this dialogue we can figure it out and there's no ambiguity, if you get in the habit of using proper names, you never have to worry about this. I would say, well, when Joe came in the room, what happened next? Was Joe wearing something when he came in the room? You said Joe took off his shoes. Where did he put them? There I used he, but in the same sentence I said, you said Joe took off his shoes. Joe. Get rid of he. And you can watch experienced forensic interviewers, and they do that. They do that. Because kids have trouble with pronouns. They're confused by negatives. Think about it. They're just beginning to understand and absorb these rules of this bizarre language that we speak called English. And there are nearly as many exceptions as there are rules. Sometimes the rules define the rule, or the exception defines the rule, and what used to be the rule is now the exception. English language is dynamic, it's living, it changes. But anyway, they're just beginning to understand language and the rules that are associated with them. And they get the rules not by us teaching them. Like I said earlier, they get them simply by context, simply by using language in the real world. It is hard enough, though, for kids to express themselves and embrace our language in a very direct, linear way, which is the way they begin to use language. John wrote his name, right? John wrote in the book. Then have to teach kids, or then kids have to understand that John did not write in the book. John didn't write in the book. A negative, what we mean by negatives is don't, won't, can't, couldn't. And the thing about negatives are, they take the positive word, they put a little apostrophe in there, they drop out a letter, and it means the opposite. He could write his name is different from he couldn't write his name. The problem is that most kids can understand, depending upon their age level, not so much preschoolers, but as they grow, a single negative. But sometimes we speak in a sentence and there are double negatives. Not the ones that cancel each other out, just ones later on in the sentence. If John couldn't reach the shelf, why didn't he, now why is a bad question, is there a reason he didn't climb on a chair? Now couldn't, didn't, remember, these kids are just beginning to understand language, they're just beginning to realize that a little apostrophe and a omission of a letter is the opposite. When you put two of those in one sentence, it can be confounding for kids, right? We'll talk more about that. Any questions or observations? Preschoolers, and this applies almost for all kids, but especially preschoolers and a little bit older, they have a tough time processing questions with multiple parts. And those are just bad questions for anybody. Lawyers sometimes object because it's a compound question, and it is a compound question. Do you recall going to the hospital, and can you tell me why? Well, that's jam-packed with problems, because there's a why question in there, there's a DUR, a do you recall question. If the answer simply is no, does the kid remember going to the hospital? We don't know, right? Or maybe the kid, I mean, what's the potential meanings of the word no? One meaning is, I recall going to the hospital, but I don't know why I went to the hospital. Or another meaning is, I don't recall going to the hospital. So then I can't tell you why. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Break down compound questions. Kids have a very rigid view of agency. Did you put your mouth on Uncle Billy's penis? Now, by agency, we mean the person who's doing something. The person who's doing something. And that is related to the next problem area, and that is subject, verb, object, sentence construction. If we look here, and I went forward a few slides, you'll see the bullet point that says passives. There's the active construction and there's the passive construction of sentences, or the active voice and the passive voice. And one thing I like to let you guys know, and other folks that we talk about, children and language, I wasn't particularly good in English grammar in college and in high school. My interest in words and language developed later in life. You know, diagramming sentences wasn't my forte. I found that kind of interesting, though. I liked drawing little lines and slashes and stuff and deconstructing things. It actually was something I was interested in, but doesn't mean I was particularly good at it. So, you know, as a grown-up, when I would hear things about active and passive voice and gerunds and dangling participles and past, present, you know, my eyes would glaze over, and I'm sure a lot of your eyes is glaze over, and I think many of you may have had a similar experience to me, and some of you may have been a superstar in language. My point is, you don't have to be any of those things to understand some of the basics of language and English grammar when it comes to communicating with kids. And I'll teach you right now the active and passive voice right away. And it's easy to understand if you think about it from a child's perspective, or the world that the child lives in. Remember, when we speak to kids, and when we read to kids, we do it very simply and very concretely. One way to appreciate how to communicate with kids and how to use effective sentence structure with kids is to buy a kid's book, a well-written kid's book, one that comes with some sort of critical appraisal that's good. A good kid's book. Get a good kid's book, and you'll see very short sentences, very concrete words. Jack ran up the hill. Jill ran up the hill. Billy plays with his soldiers. Billy puts them on a battlefield. The soldiers are dressed in green. Okay? In all of those sentences, concrete words are used, and they're short and simple and concrete. And Billy plays with his soldiers. Billy's at the beginning. The object of the sentence are the soldiers, right? That's the thing that Billy's acting on. He's playing with his toy soldiers. I'll change the sentence. Billy plays with his toy soldiers. The agent there, we're talking about rigid view of agency. The agent, the person doing something, is who? When I say Billy plays with his toy soldiers. Who's the person doing something? Billy. What is the object of the agent? What is being played with? The toy soldiers. Now, in the early years, kids are exposed to those formulations of English. The doer, Billy, is at the beginning of the sentence. The object of whatever is happening is at the end of the sentence. Jack ran up the hill. Not the hill was traversed by Jack, or the hill was where Jack ran. You know, Jack ran up the hill. Billy plays with his toy soldiers. Amanda colors her drawings with a crayon. Not the drawings were colored by Amanda. Amanda's at the beginning of the sentence. Billy's at the beginning of the sentence. Jack is at the beginning of the sentence. The thing that's acted upon, or the object of the sentence, is at the end. That is the active voice. When the doer, or the agent, in that case, Billy is the agent. Agent is synonymous with the doer. D-O-E-R, that's my phrase for the agent, the doer, the person doing the stuff, is at the beginning of the sentence. The agent is at the beginning of the sentence, and the thing acted upon is at the end of the sentence. That's what kids are comfortable with. When you switch it around, or when it is inconsistent with their expectations, their unconscious expectations from the way that we read to them and speak to them, things get messed up. There is high risk for confusion and mistake and misunderstanding. Kids do best with subject, verb, object sentence. The passive voice is when the object acted upon is generally at the beginning of the sentence. The soldiers were played with by Billy. The soldiers were moved by Billy all over the floor. The soldiers were knocked down by Billy. Now, if you use Microsoft Word, which is the word processing program that comes with most PCs, they'll put a red squiggly line under misspelled words and a green squiggly line under potential grammatical issues. And for whatever reasons, we like writing in the passive voice. I get flagged a lot writing in the passive voice. But it's not ideal. It's not the best way to write. And I try to be vigilant in looking at the voice when I'm writing memos or briefs or other things. The soldiers were knocked down by Billy is in the passive voice. How do we make that the active voice? Change it around. The soldiers were knocked down by Billy. That's the passive voice, right? Because the thing acted upon, the soldiers, is at the beginning of the sentence. And the doer, or the agent, is where? The end of the sentence. I mean, this is simple, right? Switch it around and make the sentence, Billy knocked down the soldiers. All right. I'm going to jump ahead. Children may have trouble with passives. If we're interviewing Gabriella, okay, and she was victimized by John. John had fondled her body. And we're interviewing Gabriella, and we want to find out whether Mary was a victim too. We know Gabriella's a victim. She's our interviewee. We're interviewing Gabriella. And we say to Gabriella, Gabriella, was Mary rubbed by John too? Or, to make it a little bit more concrete, Gabriella, you told me everything about how John rubbed your body on your privates and your ninnies. Was Mary rubbed by John? No. Now, later on, or perhaps even now, you're puzzled because Gabriella's been interviewed twice before, unfortunately. There's a record of Gabriella being an eyewitness to John molesting Mary. In her evaluation, she said not only did John molest Mary, but he used an object to molest Mary. So now you just said to Gabriella, well, was Mary rubbed by John also? And she says no. You're puzzled. Now, as I suggested a little while ago, just switch the question around. And you don't need to know what the problem is. I might say something like, well, and it's okay to have other information and to ask questions consistent with that information, as long as you change the question around. Well, you know, Gabriella, you told me that John touched your ninnies and rubbed your vagina. Did he do something like that to Mary? Uh-huh. Tell me about that. Now, that's inconsistent with what she just said. Or is it? Whenever there's miscommunication, it's not the child's fault, it's our fault. How might Gabriella have been interpreting the question about whether John rubbed Mary? When we say, well, you told me how John touched your ninnies and your vagina. Was Mary rubbed by John too? What is she perhaps thinking? Go ahead.
She's probably thinking, yes, I was touched, but Mary was not rubbed, like in the actual sense of rubbing.
Well, maybe the word rubbing is wrong, but I'm talking about active, passive voice. Go ahead.
She thinks Mary did something wrong.
That Mary rubbed John
first.
Right. That Mary is who? The person who's doing what?
Wrong.
Well, we're not wrong. Doing what? Rubbing. She may be, especially if it's a preschooler. Remember, they're best with the doers at the beginning. The person who is acting is at the beginning. Was Mary rubbed by John? That may be if you put a thought bubble over her head. This lady wants to know if Mary rubbed John. That never happened. John was rubbing Mary. Mary rubbed John. I didn't see that. But we have all this data, all this intelligence, all these other CPS reports and evaluations that said that Gabriella was an eyewitness. My God, what's going on? The problem is, if we don't know that, we may go forward with 30 questions and still think that John never molested Mary, and then Gabriella 30 questions later may say something about John touching Mary, and we're like, well, didn't you tell us before that that didn't happen? Well, obviously the potential for miscommunication is significant if the interviewer and the child are on dramatically different pages. And, you know, one way that can happen is by the use of the passive voice. So use the active voice. try to teach yourself to use the active voice. A related concept is not only the active voice, but agency. And one of the examples that I heard in one of my first trainings in child maltreatment was a cross-examination that purportedly happened in a real case, where Jerry, the victim, the boy victim, had testified in great detail how he had to perform oral sex on Uncle Billy. He had to fellate, he had to put his mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. And the prosecutor had developed that testimony in detail. On cross-examination, the defense lawyer, in preparing to ask whatever questions he thought might be helpful and relevant to his client's cause, said, well, you know what, Jerry, I want to talk to you about the first time that you put your mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. And Jerry says, I never put my mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. And the defense lawyer really doesn't see the opportunity yet. He says, no, I mean the time when you were in the bedroom upstairs and you put your mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. You told Mr. Del Russo about that. No, I didn't tell him that. Now the defense lawyer's like, I'm in a good spot now. These 12 jurors heard the same thing I heard. Now he's denying it. This is a great moment. So, Gerard, you didn't put your mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. That's true, right? No, I didn't. And you didn't put your mouth on Uncle Billy's penis when you said something happened in the shed about a week later, right? No, I didn't. In any event, that kind of inquiry goes on. The defense lawyer thinks he derailed the entire prosecution. When on redirect, that's the opportunity for the prosecutor to ask questions about what the defense lawyer asked. He says something like, well, Gerard, you heard Mr. Geist asking you about you putting your mouth on Uncle Billy's penis, and you said that never happened. It never happened in the shed. It never happened in the room. You know, what happened? I didn't put my mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. He put his penis in my mouth. Now, that relates to agency and who the doer is. That's kind of related to kids have a very specific understanding and appreciation of who the person is that's doing something. And they also have a very rigid view of who the agent is. Now, when we hear that, we know, well, what he really means is when he put his penis in my mouth, that I wasn't the one. But they're very rigid. I didn't do it. He did it. He's the one who was the doer. He's the one who was the agent. He's the one who made that happen. So that's another example. Now, what I'd like to do is show you, if you could hit the lights there, someone, Franklin or somebody. There's a nice video clip I have that makes this point. So bear with me a second here. I'm not sure how the volume is on this thing here yet. All right, let's see how this works. That's engaging in action. The person is doing something. You may remember the little boy who said, I didn't put my mouth on Uncle Billy's penis. He put his penis in my mouth. Similarly, the little girl in this video has a very rigid view of who the person is that's engaging in the action. And it's not her, it's someone else.
And then you went and sat on his lap then, and then he said to you, can you keep a secret? Okay, and then you said, yeah. And then what happened after that?
Did he grab my hand and put it on his robe?
When when he grabbed your hand, with what part of his body did he grab your hand with? And then you said he put it under his robe? Did he have anything on under his robe? No? Okay, so where did he put your hand?
On his private.
On his private? Okay, this part you call his private? Okay. So what happened if you put your hand on his private?
At that point, he grabbed it and I told him to stop. And then then I tried to go get my old man. And then he said, come here. And then I went. And so after that, he put my hand on his, cause I was laying down and I was looking at the pictures on the wall, and then he put his hand under my jumper, and I had panties on there, but he didn't have nothing on, just a red robe.
Okay. Private.
At that point, he grabbed it and I told him to stop.
Okay, you could turn it back on, Franklin, for a moment. Did you get that?
Mm-hmm.
Where was the agency issue? I just played it again, a little piece of it.
She didn't put her hand
She didn't put her hand
on his right.
under his robe. He took her hand. In fact, that's kind of the theme. This is at the 126 point on that video. I don't know if it's up there. I can see it here. But that's kind of the theme of the next 30 seconds, about him doing X and him doing Y. He was manipulating her body and moving her hand. You know, and her hand's on the robe, it's touching his penis. That's enough for the criminal law, and it's enough for it to be a molest, and it's enough for all that. And we all appreciate that she's not complicit in this. But to her, it's very specific and very rigid. I didn't put my hand under his robe. He took my hand and put it under his robe. And that's what we're talking about here. And it bears, I'm just going to let you watch it one more time, at least this section here. It's one, start here.
So where did he put your hand?
On his private.
There the interviewer says, where did he put your hand? And then when she refers back to it, she changes it around.
On his private? Okay, this part you call his private? Okay. So what happened if you put your hand on his private?
What happened after you put your hand on his private?
So that was intentional?
No. She again, there are so many things that are going on in your mind when you're doing a forensic interview. That's just her natural way of asking questions, and she's not thinking about the nuances of agency and all that. She's trying to ask questions here, and that she got that wrong. But this kid corrected her,
Right.
and that's okay. I use this clip because it shows you that it's on this kid's mind. The problem is when you have situations like Jerry and Uncle Billy, where they don't tell you what it is. They just go, no, it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. And then you're thinking, well, it didn't happen at all.
Right. She's really listening to what the interviewer is asking, and that's how she was able to catch it.
That's right, and that's good. If you were ever defending this interview and the quality of this interview and the competence of this child and the ability for this child to express herself, you would make the observation you just did. This is an example of the child paying attention and correcting the interviewer. And I will teach you later how to leverage those corrections into a way of enhancing the overall credibility of the interview. What Fran should have said here is, he put your hand under his robe. That's right. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah.
And if I make a mistake like that again, it's okay to tell me that, or please tell me that.
Especially for court purposes.
Exactly. And that shows a lot of things and is a very powerful argument in support of this kid's ability to give us straight information or reliable information. But my purpose here is not to get in that area where it's a little bit advanced later in the course. Right now I just want to focus on the baseline issue of agency and kids' very rigid view of agency. Let's listen to her correct Fran.
At that point, he grabbed it and I told him to stop. And then And then he said, come here. And then I went. And so after that, he put my hand on his, cause I was laying down and I was looking at the pictures on the wall. And then he put his hand under my jumper and I had panties on there, but he didn't have nothing on, just a red robe.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying about her
Yeah.
focused on agency? The whole last third of this is about who did what, and he did this, and he did that, and he made me do X, Y, and Z. Okay, Franklin, thank you. You could put the lights back on. Thank you so much. So, kids have a very rigid view of agency. Questions for preschoolers should be simple and concrete, not complex or abstract. That's something that you want to remember. I ask about that later. Okay, go ahead, sir.
So I was just gonna, do you think she was maybe afraid of being reprimanded because of what she did? You know, what part she had been doing off the church? That's what she was trying to clarify?
Yes, I think there's some of that going on as well. I think there's some of that. What's your first name again?
Eddie.
Eddie?
Yes, sir.
Eddie says, you know, that part there where she is very specific about agency and who's doing what might be also motivated by making it clear that she's not at fault, that she wasn't complicit, she wasn't involved, she didn't do anything wrong. And I think there's a lot of that going on there as well. Unfortunately, in many families, when this kind of sexual exploitation is exposed, lots of questions are asked of the child about complicity. Even if they are little and immature and incapable of doing anything other than complying, caregivers and siblings and family members always focus on what the child's role was and what the child's behavior was and why the child didn't somehow object or tell or prevent this from happening. So there is an element of kids as an act of self-preservation emphasizing that they didn't want to do it, even in cases where they did want to do it. And not that they wanted to do it and it was knowing and informed and appropriate, but they liked it or it felt good or they went back in the room or there were elements of it that were pleasing to them and that weighs on them, that could weigh on them. So they are either directly told or they learn inferentially right away that they should have done something about it, and the fact that they didn't do something about it is a problem to their mom or their grandma or their siblings or their dad or someone else. So they may focus or emphasize that the other person was doing X, Y, or Z, and sometimes they might even distort the truth and lie about what happened as a coping mechanism. They may inject statements of violence in a case where there was no violence. He threatened me. He scared me. He told me he was going to kill me if I didn't. There is some very, very basic research that you'll hear more about later that I did with Dr. Durso and Dr. Dickinson from this university, where we concluded that kids who were video recorded being molested, and I think I mentioned this in the past, not this point, but that we did this research, that kids who were video recorded being molested may have embellished their accounts and added statements of coercion that never happened. And the reason why we theorize that is because we watched the molests and we watched the modus operandi or the manner in which the molesters in this group of 9 kids molested them, and every one of them were groomers and seducers. There didn't seem to be any coercion that was utilized. They were talkers, they were incremental, they were making statements that made the child feel like they were mutual in this. The manner in which they approached these kids was the complete opposite of coercive and threatening. it was seductive and grooming, and playing to the kid's lack of self-esteem. So when you see a guy who, you know, all of his molests were defined by him going, how does that feel? If that doesn't feel okay, I'll do it differently. No, I'm okay with it. Okay, why don't you turn around? Why don't you do this? It's bothering you now? We'll stop for now. Maybe tomorrow we'll do more. You know, and you see lots of videos with that kind of approach. It's hard to believe he had scary teeth and pulled out a knife. And when one kid tells us that, you know, it seems more like they're trying to justify their complicity or what they perceive as their complicity. But that's well beyond this. Your question was that. I think there's some of that going there. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask about complicity, and in terms of, as an interviewer, how can you get across to a child that whatever they were feeling at the time is okay, and they don't have to cover up or lie to cover up their feelings, you know what I mean, without putting any words in their mouth?
Well, you know, it's a good question, and I think the way to do that is to be transparent and to say something like that. I mean, we're not putting words in their mouth. If the inference that we can draw from the interview, if the inference that we can draw from the child's responses is that they feel complicit or they think they did something wrong, I mean, we ought to use everything we know about interviewing kids and all of our experiences to address whatever issue arises in an interview. So somebody asked about fantastic elements last week or 2 weeks ago when a kid says something that's implausible or totally nuts. It doesn't make any sense. It could never have happened. And I suggested you need to address it right away. It's not going to go away. You need to confront that issue, and you need to you know, talk it out rather than leave it there. So I'll give you an example. I don't know if we have the clip here, but sometimes kids will say, you know, they're 5 years old, and they'll say, well, he tried to touch me, but I threw him on the floor and I beat him up. And then I went to my room. Now, sometimes they may say, well, it happened the first time, but the second time that it happened once or more than once. The next time he came in, and I bloodied his nose, and he fell on the floor, and I went in my room. You know, this is a 50-year-old man. It's a 5-year-old child. It's obvious that that didn't happen. So what we might say is, well, Gerard, is that something that really happened, or is that something that you wished you could have done or wished you did? And they may say, that's something that I really did. You really punched him in the nose and it got bloody, or is that something that really happened? No, I did it. You know, Gerard, you know, sometimes kids think that they're in trouble for what they did, or sometimes kids that I talk to think that they wanted it to happen. But, you know, you didn't do anything wrong, and if something happened, you really didn't have any way of controlling that, or you didn't have any way to stop it. So is that, I'm going to ask you a different way now. When you said that you bloodied his nose, is that something that you wished happened? And no, maybe they'll go, listen, if they stick to it, now there's two things going on here, addressing complicity and also addressing the fantastic statement. If they stick to it, they stick to it, and then you move on. And even though he doesn't repudiate the statement, the jury or the expert can look at it and go, he may be saying, no, he did, when we know he didn't. But it's okay to say you didn't do anything wrong. It's not your fault. It's okay if it felt good. You'll see a clip later where a kid says it felt good, and that's okay. Any other questions or observations?
Going back to the video.
Yes.
I think we're interested to find out how is it that this incident was reported to the authorities. Did the child make a disclosure, or someone else did? Because it could be that the child, that she felt that she really hadn't done anything wrong. You know, and she was making it clear to explain what transpired, as opposed to being passive. She was taking the active role in explaining this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's an issue that needs exploration. And I'll tell you what, in every case, we can learn a lot by how it came out. We can learn a lot about that, how that child feels about what happened, and we can learn a lot about how that child feels about telling by looking at how it came out, who they said it to, how they said it, what the words were that they used. Very good, very important. And we'll talk more about that later. Excuse me. Just some general issues, words that seem simple but are not. Touch, clothes, house. We talked about clothes and house earlier. Touch is a loaded word, and sometimes kids think that touch can only happen with what? Hands. And that's a problem if you have an object penetration, or if a child is not touched with their hands. The actor uses his mouth or her mouth. So what do we mean by that? Gabriella, you told me that Uncle Mike put his finger in your butt. Did he touch your coochie? Now, we have a statement that he performed oral sex on her vagina. So, and the reason I say those kind of things is we have some good information and then we're puzzled why we don't get the response. Did Uncle Mike touch you on some other part of your body? No. Well, what I'm asking you is, did Uncle Mike touch you on your feet? No. Did Uncle Mike touch you on your coochie? No. Now you're puzzled as an interviewer because you know that the information that you were presented with was that she made a prior disclosure that Uncle Mike performed oral sex on her. And now she's saying he didn't touch her vagina. How could that be? Well, this is an area where we worry about the word touch, right? Because to her, that's not a touch. That's something else. His body connected with hers. He kissed her or licked her or wherever, however you want to characterize it. But he didn't touch her, because touches happen with your hand. So we have to be mindful of that. Many kids can understand what we mean by touch. Some kids assume that it only can happen with a hand. Go ahead.
Old school diapers focused on good touch and bad touch when we would go out on sex abuse cases, which I later learned was no longer the language that we should use when we interview.
Yeah, well, we might as well address that now. That's a different issue involving touch. I'm talking about how rigid children are with the word touch. Remember, they're very rigid about a lot of things. They're just learning words, and you know, I might have a 10-year-old now, and he's like, that's what it is. He has one definition and one understanding of a particular issue, and that's what it is. If I bring up some other nuanced understanding of the issue, he challenges it. And you know, they're very rigid. They're very rigid, and this rigidity can lead to problems with the word touch. That's why it's a word that seems simple, but it's not. Now, the thing about good touch, bad touch is a little bit different. And you'll see that I'm not going to recommend that you use that formulation ever again. We recommend, and it's part of the protocol that I'll teach you later, or provide you with an overview of later, we recommend that we ask about touches the child likes and touches the child doesn't like. And here's the problem with good touch, bad touch. First of all, good and bad are loaded words, okay? And they even teach parenting now. You're not supposed to tell your kids, you were bad, you're going to go in time out. What you did was bad. My understanding of progressive parenting, one has to say, you broke the rules. You didn't follow the rules, so you have to go in time out. These rules are important. They're to protect you, to make sure you're safe. Bad is a loaded word. Good is a loaded word. And, you know, I don't offer these, and we don't recommend to abandon good and bad touch because it's, you know, popular to do so, or it's this, you know, new wave in thinking and parenting. It can have some very substantive impact on the way we interview kids. because bad means something. Think about it. If Gabrielle is molested by Gerard, if Gabrielle is molested by Gerard and Gerard is her dad, her biological father, and if we say to her, when we have information that Gerard licked her vagina and fondled her breasts, if we said to her, I want to talk about good touches and bad touches, tell me what a good touch is. I don't know, a kiss or a tickle or something like that, whatever. What about bad touches? What about dad? Did he ever give you bad touches? Or however we formulate the bad touch inquiry. Some kids may conclude that Gerard, their father, is bad. By characterizing that touch as a bad touch, we label it and we judge it. And that word bad may be imputed not only to the touch, but to the dad. And we need to get every advantage we can when interviewing kids. We know as child maltreatment professionals that these kids don't think their dad's bad. They love their dads. Now, some of the kids may not like their dads anymore, but the vast majority of them just want the touching, the uncomfortable thing to stop. Very often these dads are great dads. Very often these dads use grooming and favoritism and lots of rewards and good things to cement their exploitation of the kids. So my point is, when we begin to label the touch, the child, not all of them, but we need to do the best we can. We need to avoid any potential for making it harder to get the information from the kids. So one criticism of the bad touch is that that label, that judgment, is imputed to the accused. And in many cases, that child has tremendous affinity or affection for the accused, and they may interpret us as calling him bad or calling the accused bad, and they don't feel that way about him at all. So, that may impact upon the desire of the child to disclose. Sometimes, perhaps more than sometimes, many times, the children are compliant, I'll call it, rather than complicit. It may start out as not liked or not wanted, but it may feel good. And part of them may look forward to these sessions where they're touched and fondled and kissed and caressed. Human sexuality feels good, even on kids. Their bodies have nerve endings. So my point is, if the child in part felt pleasure from this and was conflicted about it and in some ways looked forward to it or liked it, not only are we labeling the touch bad and they may infer that the accused is bad, who else might be bad?
Their father.
They're bad.
Oh,
It's a bad touch. Well, their father, I just got done saying that, yeah, but I'm changing it now.
not the child.
The child who was compliant and feels that they are involved and in their mind they know that they liked it and look forward to it, we're now characterizing that touch as bad and they may infer that they're bad. Right? So bad touch is problematic because kids may draw conclusions about themselves or about the actor from that label that we put on it. Similarly, if it felt good, how can it be bad? To some kids, we are judging the touch as bad. Let's forget about whether they're bad or not. Let's think about the kid who it felt good, completely good. And they liked it. Their experience was one of pleasure, and we are now directly judging them by labeling it bad. Better to ask kids about touches they like and don't like. Let them put the label on the behavior, not us. You'll see a clip where a child says it felt good and doesn't think anything about it. She's very young, which you would expect. The older kids get the sense it shouldn't have felt good. I shouldn't have felt good. So the characterization, the labels of good touch, bad touch, have the capacity to influence the kid's perception of themselves and of the actor, and make it, in some cases, less likely they would disclose to us. Or they may feel more emotional, or less interested in communicating with us because we declared them bad. And we'll talk more about that later. Go ahead.
I use the language bad choice to a child. So I removed the child from their parent, and she questioned why did I remove from my mom? And I said, well, your mom didn't really make a good decision or made a bad choice or something like that. And immediately she said, my mom's not a bad person. She's a good person. So it's funny that you mentioned using the bad word to her was like, this is my mom. My mom's good. She meant well, Then later on I had to explain that some parents make good decisions and some make bad decisions, but it does not mean that your mom's a bad person. So then it was like a moment. But, the word bad definitely, my mom's a good person.
Well, thank you for validating what I'm talking about here. And I can see that. No, I can see that. And that's a little more attenuated, too. I mean, this isn't even about the touch. Remember, the touch involves the kid and the caregiver and the dad or the whoever it is, right? The actor or a person who did it. So, they're kind of wrapped up in that label because they're part of the scene that we're labeling. They're liking it or not liking it. They're involved. They're complicit. It's their dad or uncle or grandpa who's the touch. So these labels are directly correlated to either them or the guy, and it's problematic. You simply said, when you were questioned about why these events have to happen or what's next or why whatever's unfolding is unfolding, well, mom made some bad decisions. And, man, that word bad, my mom's not bad, right? Is that what she said? Something like that?
Exactly. She was very defensive.
So you could see how...
7 or 8 years old.
Yeah, you could see how that conclusion, And, I probably feel the same way, If my mom was still around and somebody said, your mom made a bad decision, I know enough to understand what they're saying, but, I say something, but she's not a bad person.
Right.
We could draw the distinction between the decision and the person. They can't. Right. That labels immediately becomes the mom label,
right.
And it's problematic. There are touches that you get that you like, and there are touches that you get you don't like.
Right.
And you know what? You go, well, what if the touch felt good? Well, then that'll be among the touches she likes.
Yeah.
If they know that it's not good or not bad, and they like it but they don't like it, they may put it in the touches they don't like. But we need to abandon these labels. There's no point in putting these labels on the behavior. We need to explore the child's perception of what happened, their labels, how they felt about the touches, and go in that direction. So kids may have trouble with complex sentences. They may have trouble with passives. We talked about that. Here's some complex negation. These negatives. Didn't you see Sam kiss Susie's coochie? You couldn't see that Susie wasn't wearing her shirt? Now you say, oh, we don't talk like that. You do. Now, you have to put these things in context. Where were you? I was in the basement. Where was Susie? She was there, too, by the Monopoly game. Did Susie have a shirt on? I don't know. You couldn't see that Susie wasn't wearing her shirt?
That's the face.
If the child was so far away that it was hard for her to see what Susie had on above the waist, what's the right answer? You couldn't see that Susie wasn't wearing her shirt.
Yeah, you want to give a pleasing answer to the
No, but what is the right answer? I don't know. We need to diagram. You could not see, so that means it's not that I could see.
Right.
The kid has to go, I could see? No, I could not see that
Right.
Susie was not wearing her shirt. I mean,
Yeah. Confusing.
if this guy, look at the next one. If
Right.
this guy, Sam, was Susie's uncle, what's the correct response to, isn't Sam Susie's uncle? Is it yes or no? Is not Sam Susie's uncle? Remember, they're learning that isn't means is not.
Right.
So does that not mean that Sam is Susie's uncle? I think if you break this down and turn the contractions into full words, the answer should probably be, is not Sam, no, it's not. I don't know. It's very confusing.
Is Sam Susie's uncle?
Yes.
Well, thank you for saying that the right way. Is Sam Susie's uncle?
No, but if you were answering that question, is not
Right, it's
Sam
not
Susie's
Sam.
uncle, you'd have to say yes. Sam is not Susie's uncle.
I'm confused by Sam.
But what if Sam is Susie's uncle? What's the right answer? No.
Sam is Susie's uncle. You have to
Let's
change
not
that.
go there. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
lesson here, okay?
7-year-old will be like, what?
Is Sam Susie's uncle?
That's a way better question.
Yeah. Children are going to have trouble with abstracts. We talked about that truth, this area here. Relationships, relational expressions, time, speed, size, and duration. The reason why relational expressions are problematic is kids don't have a lot of life experience. What's big to a kid is not necessarily big to a grown-up. What's old and young, I mean, we've all had experience, you know. He was really old. Almost as old as you. Okay? We all like to think we're not that old, right? But to kids, we're really old. Even you youngsters. It's relative, and it is driven by the kid's experience, right? So one needs to be cautious when using relationship expressions. They're also referred to as comparatives. I like to think of them like that because words like big, fast, old, young, they have no meaning really unless you compare them to something else, right? A tree could be big, but if you compare it to an oak tree, if you compare a simple tree to an oak tree, the oak tree is a lot bigger. If you compare an oak tree to a redwood out in California, the oak tree is small. It's big on my lawn, but it's small compared to a redwood. You know, I'm about 6 foot tall, but I ain't that big compared to Shaquille O'Neal. And Shaquille O'Neal is not that big compared to a 747 jumbo jet, right? And a 747 jumbo jet is small compared to the planet Mars. All these things are relative. So we need to be mindful of that when we ask kids questions. And especially in stranger molests, we need to ask kids questions about what they looked like or how tall they were or how old they were. So we need to compare that to something known. We need to compare the child's statement about tall, short, big, small, fast, slow, to something that's known. And we'll look at a video clip in a second. Kinship terms are problematic. Why? Well, grandma and aunt, although they're a bit more specific than she,
People have 2 grandmas. Oh.
people have 2 grandmas, 3 grandmas. My son's got a step, my son's biological father remarried. He was counting his grandparents the other day, and there were more than 2. They're placeholders. They're substitutes for proper names. I like to say, what do you call grandma? Grandma. What's her first name? Grandma. If they differentiate and say, I call this one Nana, this one Grandma, we need to refer to them as Grandma. But I like to call them Grandma Rose, Nana, Beatrice or whatever. Kids have a tough time with number. We ask, when I say we recommend in the Finding Words Corner House protocol, once or more than once. And there are ways to find out about specific incidents, the first time. Some kids like to talk about the last time. Some kids like to talk about the time they remember best. Sometimes kids talk about a time that was different from all the others. Once or more than once is good enough. You ask them how many times? Get ready for kooky responses. Go ahead. Unless they're older and they go, I don't know how many times, a lot. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask, in
comparison to, like, let's say preschoolers and teens, is it necessary in a forensic interview, I guess, for like, when it comes to like charging the alleged person? Do you really need to get specific with the preschooler about how many times? Does it matter, or does it only matter when it comes to teens, because you may get a more accurate answer?
The specific amount of times never matters. So the answer is no, it doesn't matter. However, we need to know whether it was multiple times, and we need to have some sense about duration, especially in the criminal law. So once or more than once, and some sense of what their age was or what the context of the first time was and the age and context of the last time, so we can have a sense of duration. In the criminal law, the charges may differ based upon the age of the child, so we want to understand the duration of the behavior or the block of time in which they were molested, and that we're pretty good at getting that. The exact number of times is not relevant at all. So we ask once or more than once. And then we ask, some kids like, I need to know everything about what happened. Some kids like to talk about the first time. Some kids can talk about the last time. And sometimes kids remember one time best. What time do you want to talk about? Because they already said it happened more than once, what it is, so now we need to get some detail about what happened. And you get some examples, and that's it. We don't need to get them all. The law doesn't demand that.
So the charges only, I guess if it was more duration and not necessarily, so one person, let's say that molested a kid 10 times, does that person get more or less than somebody that just molested a kid once?
Well, it all depends. If a person molested a child 10 times over a period of 5 years, then the child's age might have changed during that time period. If you molest a kid under 13, it's more serious than a kid over 13. It's all horrible. But you're going to get prosecuted more severely. The jail time is a lot more for little kids than older kids. So, that span of time influences the outcome, the punitive outcome, how someone's going to get punished. So that's important to understand. But a guy who molests 10 times versus a guy who molests 30 times, that's not going to affect the outcome. What's going to affect the outcome is how old the kid was and the level of intrusiveness. So 3 times, if a 7-year-old was digitally penetrated 5 times or 50 times, my experience is people are going to look at it the same way. What differentiates it if it was different, or if it was more intrusive, or there were multiple acts that were intrusive, that might change the dynamics of the judges and the system's perception of how grievous this offense was, how serious it was. But the sheer number of times, 10 times, 50 times. Look, if you have a thing that happened over a 30-year period, that's different. But most of these things we really don't know how many times. And more than once is very, very bad. And we can put people in jail for the rest of their lives with more than once. So we don't really focus on 10 or 50. But sometimes we're able to know that, or at least have a sense of whether it's 50 or not, especially when they're recorded or there's some other indicator. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the concept of time, like even when they're older, they don't really grasp it. Because I had a 17-year-old and she had cancer, and when she was going for chemotherapy, they found out that she had HIV as well.
Mm-hmm.
When they asked her how she got it, she talked about how her mother's boyfriend used to come in and rape her at night, but she couldn't. She remembered when it started and when it stopped, but she couldn't tell you like how many times it happened. It started when I was 6th grade. It stopped in 8th grade. It's like everything else she blocked out. And she was 17, so you can imagine like someone that's younger how they could just not grasp. You ask how many times.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And there is no simple correlation between age and an inability to express how many times an act of molestation occurred. Even adults have difficulty. I've had adult victims of incest. You know, they can differentiate between 1 or 7 or 15, and they can speak to us about that. But because of the way that they experienced it, and because of the way recollection works, they don't know that answer. But at least they'll say, I don't know, a lot. You know, it seemed like 2 or 3 times a week.
She said every night. That was her way of answering. She didn't say a number. She just said it happened every night from 6th grade to 8th grade.
Right. And did it literally happen every night? Probably not, but it could have. And what that means is it felt like every night, most of the time, nearly every night, 5 nights a week. And, you know, we'll never know exactly how many nights. Like, he might have been out of town for some days. He might have got drunk one night and passed out. So it really couldn't have happened every night. But what that typically means is every time he had an opportunity and I was home and he was home, he did it. Every time. Every time there was opportunity, he did it. But the law is not that callous. The law is not that demanding. The law doesn't require that kind of precision from kids. The problem with that is, too, is even among adults, is when you are repetitively abused or when you experience anything repetitively, one time merges into the other. It's one big blob of experience. You know? You know, how many times have you gone out to a school to interview a kid? I mean, you may go out to the school 20 or 30 times a month to interview a kid. I don't know. I mean, if there's something that you do over and over again, you can't tell without going to the records. Luckily, we adults have records sometimes and figure out how many times. But we could give ballpark estimates how many times we went out to a school in 2010. Do we know with precision how many times you went out to a school to interview a kid in 2010? No. Yes.
Wouldn't the child typically remember if something more traumatic happened, or this is the first time that he penetrated, or this was the first, you know,
Maybe.
Something more dramatic happens?
Maybe. But those are the kinds of things that we want to look for. When it's multiple molest, we ask questions like, well, how did it usually happen? If there were molests nearly every night or whenever he could get a chance, and it happened for 6th to 8th grade, you know, they're not going to be able to tease out one from the other, especially if it was very similar. Well, how did it usually happen? Was there some time when it was different? What was different? What did he do? And nearly every case, you'll find one where he did it in a car, he picked her up from school and drove in an abandoned part of the parking lot or isolated part of the parking lot. Or a time when he simply didn't kiss and lick, another time when he took out his penis, and attempted to penetrate her. And you may get one of those, and then they go back to the way they used to. So that's another strategy to try to focus on the kinds of incidents rather than the number of times. Okay? You don't need to know how many times. Adolescence, now we're moving on to adolescence. You know, they can have the language skills of school children if they're undereducated, underparented, unattached, developmentally disabled. So many of the rules we just talked about, many of the problem areas, can apply to teenagers. Even if they're normally developed, but they can apply almost like they apply to preschoolers and latency age kids if they're undereducated, underparented, unattached, or developmentally disabled. You want to avoid using words like always or never or any or ever. And the reason is these words call for what the linguists describe as a global memory search. Now, we grown-ups understand when an interviewer says, you know, did your boss ever touch you on your body? Let's say it's a sexual harassment investigation, and they ask an adult victim. You know, we know to answer that, yes or no, depending upon what our recollection is. To small children, let's say preschoolers all the way up to 7 or 8 years old, and maybe older, depending upon their development, when they hear words like never and ever, it calls for what has been described as a global memory search. And sometimes they can have a kind of meltdown, a linguistic meltdown. Because to them, that requires an entire search of their memory. Did it ever happen this way means that that kid has to search all possibilities. Every time it ever happened, every time they were alone with dad, all of the potential and possible scenarios where this could have happened, and they simply say, I don't know, or no. Because it's too hard. It can cause a kind of cognitive logjam, if you will. The gears come grinding shut. Now, evers and ever and always and those kind of words, to adults, they don't really create that kind of problem. But to kids, sometimes it creates a problem because they can't think back to all the possibilities that there ever were. And they just rather avoid that question by saying, I don't know, or saying no. Now, this is the more nuanced aspect of language in kids. Why that happens, I don't know. I don't know that linguists even know. But, you know, we want to do the best we can, and we want to leverage our ability to talk to kids. So we try to get rid of the word ever or never, any. For some reason, any calls for what linguists describe as negative polarity. And what we mean by that is, for whatever reasons, when you ask someone a question with the word any in it, when people are uncertain or unsure, or uncomfortable or nervous, they're going to answer no to that question. And sometimes, even people that are very comfortable answer no. It pulls for a negative response, and I'm not quite sure why, but this is the observation of linguists. For example, did you have something for lunch? And I'm in a freeze frame, make believe I have a remote in my hand. Did you have something for nut? Did you have something for lunch? I asked Franklin. He says no, freeze frame. What's your first name again?
Natalie.
Natalie saw him eating a bagel over in the lunchroom. Hit the play button again. Did you have something for lunch, Franklin? No, just a bagel. Pause. Well, so you did have something for lunch. Yes. Well, you started out by saying no. For whatever reasons, sometimes a question involving the word any pulls for a no. We don't quite know why. So one of the recommendations of language professionals is get rid of the word any and use the word some. You'll see me, and I don't do it all the time, but you'll hear me from now on use the word some instead of any whenever I can. You will hear me, instead of saying, is there anyone here who has a question, I will say, is there someone here who has a question? I made it my business to try to, adopt the some rather than the any. If it results in a 0.05% of kids understanding us better, then that's a good day, If we can teach ourselves to avoid the word any and use the word some, and some kids benefit from that, then it's a good day. The corner house interviewers, they train themselves. Our interviewers, you'll see them use any on some of my videos here. But lately they have used less any's and more sums. So did you have something for lunch? Yes, a bagel. However, whatever causes this phenomena, it doesn't happen when you use the word some. Kids have a tough time with before and after, with forget. You want to avoid legalese, attorney, subsequent, perpetrator. I mean, if there's any lesson from your interviews of the second and third and first graders in Learning Project 1, it's that these words are foreign to kids, right? Jargon, I submit to you that. Ambiguity, visiting relatives, that's ambiguous. If we mean visiting relatives are relatives that come to our house, or is visiting relatives something that you do, right? In one case it's a verb, in the other case it's an adjective. Flying planes, that they're either planes that fly or planes that we fly. I like this one. Did there a time when you went over grandma's house? Did daddy ever stay over grandma's house? Now, we may understand what we mean, but if a kid's taking it very literal, they may have a vision of him flying over grandma's house. One time my friends, I don't know why, when I was a teenager, it was, my friends, come on, man, we're going to go do this. Yeah, man, sneak out of your house and we're going to do this. And I went and I turned around and I walked back to my house. They wanted to go sleep on the roof of the synagogue in Livingston. I'm not sure why that was cool. But it was the height of cool for me as a 15-year-old, pimply-faced kid. They were like the cool kids in town had invited me to go sleep on the roof of the synagogue and climb out of my bedroom window. But I would have been literally over the synagogue. Did Joe come over the synagogue? Not only did he come over it, he slept there. But I didn't. I went back home and they slept there. I was uncool. You want to be mindful of these kind of figures of speech. We use them a lot in the English language. And if you look at these terms of art, these figures of speech, literally, they can be really confusing. Do you remember? I mentioned before there was a sentence that started out with, do you recall, that compound sentence. And I said, this is terrible. Do you recall going to the hospital and can you tell me why? Okay? We want to avoid those kinds of things. Do you remember if Grandpa came in your room? Do you remember if Johnny touched Mary or rubbed Mary? Do you remember? These are linguistic baggage. They are unnecessary. We talk this way all the time, and you'll see interviewers from time to time making these mistakes of inquiry. They're extraneous. They're unnecessary. We want to be efficient with our questions, and we don't want to ask questions, number one, that give the kids an out. Do you remember Grandpa going into the bedroom? No. Does that mean Grandpa didn't go into the bedroom, or they simply don't remember Grandpa going into the bedroom, or something else? I don't know. Do you remember? We call them DUR questions. DUR. Do you remember? Do you recall? Now, a variant of that is, can you recall? Can you tell me? Now, adult interviewers love putting that at the beginning of their questions. And it's not a good practice. Number one, it creates an ambiguous sentence or an ambiguous question, and we don't know what the answer is if they say yes or no, or give a single word response. It gives the child an out by simply saying, no, I don't remember, it's unclear, it adds no value. They're valueless. DURs are valueless. They're extraneous. They're baggage. They need to be scrapped, jettisoned, thrown out, not used. Every question there ever was or ever will be that is asked with the DUR prefix can be asked better by scrapping the DUR. I challenge you to come up with any question, unless it's one about memory capacity, that you simply can't scrap that, lop it off, throw it out, and it's still the same question, but a better question. Do you remember what Grandpa was wearing? What was Grandpa wearing? Can you tell me if John rubbed Mary? Did John rub Mary? Wasn't that your question before? Did John rub Mary? Can you tell me? Maybe. Did John rub Mary? Do you recall if Big Bob climbed the ladder? Did Big Bob climb the ladder? Every question, you can simply lop that off. So let's avoid those things. Multi-syllabic words, words with a lot of syllabus, I think that's intuitive, bad, preceding, unintentional, accidental. Demonstrate for me, show me. These are problem areas. Avoid tag questions. I mean, these are the worst. Tag questions are questions where the interviewer says what happened and simply puts the tag on. Didn't he? Doesn't he? Isn't that right? Isn't that a fact? Isn't that true? Now, defense lawyers, that's their bread and butter. They want to ask questions that way. Not forensic interviewers. Those are questions that can be highly misleading to kids. You want to avoid them. Kids have a tough time with prepositions. In, on, above, ahead, behind. Pronouns we've gone over in great detail. This is a nice example. I saw John and Max touching. He had a big one. Who had a big one? You'll never know unless we ask additional questions because of that pronoun. We talked about time concepts children use. You know, especially kids up to age 6. We talked about how many times. Well, they have a tough time with chronology and sequence and calendar time. So we need to be careful. We need to ask questions that are relevant to their experience. I remember my son, when he was 4 or 5, he would want to know how long it took to get to some other place if we're going on a drive. You know, I would tell him it's going to take 2 Doras or a half a Dora. Because that was something that was meaningful to him. He would watch Dora the Explorer. An episode was 15 minutes. You know. So that had meaning to him. I would ask him if I needed to know something about time. You know, how many Doras, or how many Speed Racers, or whatever he was watching at the time. How many Power Rangers. And that has meaning. To this day, I can get more precision anchoring my questions with a television program that I know he's familiar with, rather than a week, a month, or an hour, or those kind of things. He's 10 now. He has a pretty decent sense of what an hour means, or what a week means, or yesterday and today, and those things. But it's not until right about now that's almost adult-like. Almost. But if you get from 9 and below, and especially 7 and below, they got a problem with that. So we need to be simple.
My kids will ask me how many sleeps until that happens.
Yeah.
Instead of how many days.
Yeah. Well, tomorrow, for the longest time, till about 7:30, 8, to my son Daniel, was the next day. Where am I going the next day? Am I going to Grandma's the next day? That's tomorrow. That was tomorrow. That was his characterization of tomorrow, the next day. You want to avoid sudden topic shifts and sudden time shifts. The way to avoid sudden topic shifts is if a child tells you, well, the time I remember most is it happened in the shed. Well, tell me everything that happened in the shed. And they tell you a little bit. What else happened in the shed? Did he touch that party in the shed? Was there someone else in the shed? The shed. Don't want to go from the shed to the bedroom, then back to the shed, back to the bedroom, back to the time it happened in the schoolyard. Stay in the shed. Now, Gabriella, that you've told me all about what happened in the shed, I want to talk about the time in the school parking lot. You need to signal shifting from topics. Even though it's obvious to us adults, you still need to signal to the child that you're jumping around. And don't jump around. But if you have to go from one area to the next, you need to cue the child that you're changing topics. You want to avoid sudden topic shifts. You want to avoid sudden time shifts. You want to remember that age, size, and time are relative. You want to avoid why questions. Now, we're going to look at more of these things. I'm going to pick up this lecture the next time we meet. But I do want to show you a video clip that speaks to age, size, and time. So let me go back to the Blackboard Learning module. Where's my back button?
This children and language clip is about comparatives. You'll learn rather quickly that tall, short, fast, slow, big, small, all have no meaning unless they are compared to something or someone. Watch the interviewer and tell me how tall the suspect was, if you can.
So is he a short guy or a tall guy or? He's short or tall? He's tall?
He's a like short guy.
Okay.
Julio's tall.
So how, I'm wondering if he was taller. So is he a short guy or a tall guy or? He's short?
I'm not sure what Fran was concluding. The child, now it's blurred out, but the child simply is sitting on a bleacher seat. She holds her hand about 8 inches above her head, and Fran says he's short. So I'm not sure, but again, you know, it's easy to sit here, and this is part of a whole interview where she's got a lot of stuff going on, but I'm not sure how she makes that conclusion. But the child, fortunately, doesn't stop there.
Is he tall?
She says the word tall now. Fran parrots it. She stands up.
Tall?
He's a like short guy.
She says he's like a short guy, and now she extends her hand even further over her head, kind of waves it a little, while she stands.
Okay.
Julio's tall.
So how, I'm wondering if he was taller.
We can find out some sense of how tall this person was if we bring one person in the whole planet to the Child Advocacy Center for comparison. Who's that? Who should we bring to get a sense of the person that she's talking about, right? Julio, right? The only thing that this child gives us is something about Julio. We know that this person is shorter than Julio. Okay. Watch. Well, you even uttered it when we were listening. You don't have to put the lights down. No.
This children and language.
So is he a short guy or a tall guy or? He's short or tall? He's tall?
He's a like short guy.
Okay.
Julio's tall.
So how,
He's a short guy. Julio's tall. Now, we don't know who Julio is without watching the old video. But my point is, short and tall and fast and slow and smart and not so smart and strong and weak and all that has no meaning unless you compare it to something. Strong is a relative word. Okay? Tall is a relative word. Fast is a relative word. You know, we used to think computers were fast in 1999, and then you got a computer in 2004, it was really fast. And now you got computers now, they're really fast. And 5 years from now, people will be, oh my God, you used an iPad? It was so slow. It's all relative. He's short. Julio's tall. One thing I can do is, if I get Julio, wherever he is in time and space, and bring him in this room, I know that the target of this inquiry is shorter than that guy. That's all I know, but it's better than I was before she mentioned Julio. Before she mentioned Julio, I got tall, short, tall, hands up, hands down. I have no idea how tall this guy is, because we're using words that have no meaning. Tall has no meaning, right? Now, when two adults are talking, we go, is he tall? No, he's tall. Okay. We may be able to communicate or have some sense of how tall someone is simply by saying, you know, that guy, your teacher, is he tall or short? No, he's tall. We as grown-ups go, all right, the average guy is 5'9", 5'10", you know, tall is 6 foot, kind of tall, 6'2". You know, we got a sense of, the men, the typical male, what tall means. So if we're walking through the hallway here and, you know, we're looking at all the men and that we see and all the instructors, until we see a guy that's 6'2" or bigger, we're not going to think that any of them's the instructor. Oh, no, he's pretty tall. He's a tall guy. We kind of know what that means. But this little girl, I don't know what the hell she means. I have no idea what she means. And the only reason when we're in a good position is because we're all in a similar place in terms of life experience. Okay? We all have a sense of what the average male is, kind of, and the average short guy and the average tall guy. And, you know, when we say, oh, the teacher down at the hall is pretty tall. He's a tall guy. You know, it's not that there's no comparison. There is a comparison. It's an intuitive. It happens. You intuit. You figure out. In your mind, you know what the average tall guy is, and in your mind, you expect that the person you see teaching the class down the hall, who's the tall teacher, is going to be taller than the average guy, 5'10" to 6 foot or whatever, 5'7" to 5'9". I don't know what the average guy is. So you're comparing in your mind what your perception of an average size man is. So that happens. This little girl has no sense of the average size guy. They don't think in those terms. They just, you know, compared to them, they might think. One thing we recommend is ask whether they're taller than dad or shorter than dad, if there's a dad or a male figure, or shorter than mom or taller than mom, or the interviewer stands up and say, is he taller than me or shorter than me? One thing that's fun about Fran's a great interviewer. Fran is petite and small. Some of the kids are taller than her. We get a chuckle out of that now and then. But doesn't matter. You know, Fran can stand up and go, is he taller than me or shorter than me? Why? Because there's a comparison going on. And that's the linguistic challenge with relational words. Words that have no meaning unless you compare them to something. Any questions about that or experiences with this same issue in your own life or your practice? Okay. We're going to finish up the next class by continuing this lecture on children and language. Okay? We'll look at a little bit of Professor Walker's chapter 3 and 4. There's one video clip that we didn't look at, pronoun and kinship terms. So next week we'll finish the lecture part of Learning Module 3. You'll have your discussion boards on the 13th and the 17th, and I will attempt to have them graded by the time we come back to class for our next meeting. Let's take a look at your learning projects. Your next one is due November 14th, so you have a lot of time till then. In fact, as I recommend, we're probably better off looking at the course due dates. This is the Bible here. This is the thing that tells me what's upcoming. So you got your discussion board posts. You're going to finish up your reading and looking at the videos and everything else in this learning module. we'll finish up linguistic communicative competence, and next week, when we leave, you'll begin your learning module 4 on memory and suggestibility. Questions?
Where do we view our grades?
You have to log on the Blackboard, and one of the default boxes, I think, that comes up is My Grades.
Okay.
But I don't know, maybe you ask, is that right, students?
Yeah.
If you
As soon as you open up, it should be right there, it's the second one. The second link, it says My Grades.
Okay.
If you can't find
On the
it,
homepage though,
Press home.
right? If you're on the homepage.
In Blackboard.
Press home on the top.
Okay.
Yeah, you're, the first time you go on Blackboard.
I've seen it, but by accident, and I don't know where I found it.
Yeah, it sounds like you need to go, sometimes you may open Blackboard and you'll be somewhere other than the homepage, so you won't see that, so you gotta make sure you go to the homepage.
Okay.
Let's see if there's,
Because it opens to like an announcement page, doesn't it?
Oh, that's
Of
what.
course.
Oh.
Right,
No.
it's the first one says announcement.
yes,
and
this
the
is the way
second
I've
one says
designed it
My
though.
Grades.
Oh,
It should open to this.
Uh-huh.
You might see it in a different way. Let me turn off edit mode, because
So on the left.
it should see something like this. I'm not sure, oh, here, homepage, see this link here? Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to go there, and I have my own thing, there's these boxes, yours is
And then it'll
different.
say grades down below.
Yeah, yours, this is a professor's thing here, but one of these should be My Grades.
Okay.
And then you would, I don't think the grades are here, I think you need to click on a hyperlink, right?
Yeah, it's a link. Yeah.
Yeah. Tools?
Yeah, academic and then.
No, it's not.
No, it's when you open up, it's gonna say announcements, My Grades, and then something else. And then if you have multiple classes, like, you know how it tells you courses, how many courses you have, then you can put that way.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll see you next week.